Guitarist Ace Frehley, one of the founding members of the rock group Kiss, has died.
When news first broke about the tragic passing of Ace Frehley, the legendary guitarist and founding member of Kiss, the rock world was left in absolute disbelief. For decades, Ace had been a larger-than-life figure, the wild, charismatic spaceman whose blistering solos and electrifying presence helped define one of the most iconic rock bands in history. But behind the fame, makeup, and explosive stage performances, there were years of tension, heartbreak, and silence between Ace and his former bandmates, especially Paul Stanley and Gene Simmons. For years, fans had speculated about the real truth behind Kiss's fractured brotherhood. While the band continued on, Ace often stood apart, a man who struggled with demons, fame, and a strained bond with those he once called family. The fallout between him, Paul, and Gene was one of rock's most painful and public splits, marked by accusations, hurt pride, and broken trust. But when Ace passed away, everything changed. The words that Paul Stanley and Gene Simmons shared afterward weren't just tributes, they were confessions. For the first time, the two men who had built their careers alongside Ace openly reflected on their mistakes, regrets, and the deep emotional scars left behind. Their confessions stunned fans. Raw, honest, and heartbreakingly human, suddenly the story of Kiss wasn't just about fame or music. It was about friendship, forgiveness, and the cost of pride. Because when Paul Stanley and Gene Simmons finally spoke about Ace Frehley after his death, the truth they revealed wasn't just shocking. It was a painful reminder that sometimes reconciliation comes too late. In the early 1970s, rock music was changing, louder, flashier, and more unapologetic than ever before. But in the heart of New York City, four men were about to take it to a level no one had ever imagined. Paul Stanley, Gene Simmons, Peter Criss, and Ace Frehley didn't just want to play music. They wanted to create an experience. And so in 1973, Kiss was born. Each member became more than a musician. They became characters, icons of theatrical rock. Gene, the demon. Paul, the star child. Peter, the Catman. And Ace, the spaceman. Together, they built a brand that would redefine what it meant to be a rock band. With pyrotechnics, costumes, and face paint, Kiss transformed concerts into explosive, otherworldly spectacles. Ace Frehley quickly stood out. His electrifying guitar solos, carefree attitude, and mysterious aura made him a fan favorite. To many, Ace wasn't just a member of Kiss, he was the heartbeat of their sound. His riffs on songs like Shock Me and Cold Gin became the blueprint for countless guitarists who grew up idolizing him. But while Kiss conquered the world with albums like Destroyer and Love Gun, tensions were brewing behind the scenes. Ace was a free spirit, a man who thrived on spontaneity and chaos. Gene and Paul, meanwhile, were perfectionists who treated Kiss as a disciplined business empire. That difference in mindset created cracks in their brotherhood. Still, in the beginning, the bond was real. Paul once said, "Ace was one of us. We were brothers who had nothing, chasing a dream that felt impossible." They shared cramped hotel rooms, cheap meals, and long nights on the road, fighting exhaustion and doubt. When success finally came, it was intoxicating. The world adored them, and for a while they believed they were unstoppable, but fame has a way of magnifying flaws. Ace's struggles with alcohol and substance abuse became harder to ignore. He began missing rehearsals, showing up late for shows, and clashing with Gene and Paul over creative control. What once felt like brotherhood began to feel like a battlefield. Gene, ever the businessman, pushed for structure and discipline. Paul wanted consistency and musical growth. Ace, however, wanted freedom, to play his way, live his way, and not answer to anyone. Their differences, once part of the magic that made Kiss unique, began to tear them apart. By the late 70s, the tension had reached its breaking point. Ace felt alienated, outnumbered by Gene and Paul's dominance over the band's decisions. Meanwhile, Gene and Paul felt betrayed by Ace's lack of commitment. In interviews years later, Ace would admit, "I loved those guys, but I couldn't live like that. I wasn't built for control." When Ace finally walked away from Kiss in 1982, It was both inevitable and tragic. Fans were devastated. The spaceman, the man who helped define Kiss's sound and soul, was gone. The band moved on, bringing in new members, reinventing their image and continuing to tour the world. But something essential was missing. Even as Kiss soared to greater commercial heights, both Paul and Gene later admitted that losing Ace left a hole they could never truly fill. The chemistry, that unspoken connection that made their early music timeless, was gone. For years, the wounds remained open. There were reunions, interviews, and fleeting moments of reconciliation, but the trust was never the same. Still, deep down, both Gene and Paul knew that their story with Ace wasn't over. It was just waiting for one final, painful chapter. Because when Ace Frehley's life came to a sudden and heartbreaking end, everything they had buried for decades, the anger, the guilt, and the love, came flooding back. And the confessions that followed would leave the entire rock world speechless. After Ace Frehley left Kiss in 1982, the band's glittering facade began to show its cracks. The departure wasn't just the loss of a guitarist. It was the loss of a spirit that had once fueled their raw energy and rebellious edge. Ace was the wild card, the lightning bolt in their creative storm. Without him, something about Kiss changed forever. Paul Stanley and Gene Simmons pressed forward with their usual determination. They hired new guitarists, released albums, and eventually even removed the signature makeup that had made them famous. But no matter how many times they reinvented themselves, fans couldn't help but ask the same question: where's Ace? Meanwhile, Ace's life was spinning out of control. Free from the tight structure of Kiss, he should have been liberated. But instead, he fell deeper into his addictions. Alcohol and drugs, once a source of escape, became his cage. He attempted a solo career, releasing Frehley's Comet in 1987, which gained some attention. But behind the scenes, the old demons never left. Paul and Gene watched from afar as Ace's self-destruction made headlines. They were frustrated, but also heartbroken. In later years, Gene admitted, "I loved Ace like a brother." But you can't help someone who doesn't want to be helped. That confession hinted at the emotional conflict the band members carried, a mix of anger, disappointment, and lingering affection. The 80s and early 90s became a blur of silence between them. Paul and Gene focused on keeping the Kiss machine alive, while Ace battled personal chaos. Interviews from that era often showed his bitterness. He'd accused Gene and Paul of betrayal, claiming they treated him as disposable. Yet in his quieter moments, he confessed that he missed the bond they once had, that brotherhood forged in smoky bars and endless road trips before fame poisoned everything. Then came 1996, the Kiss reunion tour. For the first time in nearly 2 decades, the original 4 members reunited, donning their iconic makeup once again. Fans were ecstatic, and for a brief moment it felt like old wounds were healing. The chemistry returned, the laughter resurfaced, and on stage, it seemed as though time had reversed. But behind the smiles, the same old issues simmered beneath the surface. Paul and Gene were still running Kiss as a business. Strict schedules, controlled decisions, and a relentless drive for perfection. Ace, however, still played by his own rules. His struggles with sobriety occasionally clashed with the band's demanding pace. Paul recalled, "There were nights I looked at him and saw the same kid I met in 1973, brilliant, funny, reckless. And there were nights I saw a man lost inside himself." The reunion tour ended, and the temporary truce faded with it. Once again, Ace drifted away, unable to find lasting peace within the Kiss empire or within himself. Still, he remained an essential part of the band's mythology. His face, his riffs, and his energy were imprinted on every fan who ever raised the Kiss logo high. By the 2010s, as the band aged and slowed its touring schedule, something unexpected happened. Gene and Paul began reflecting on their past with surprising honesty. They started speaking more gently about Ace, no longer as the unreliable guitarist, but as a flawed friend they had once loved deeply. Gene said in one interview, "I wish I'd told him more often how much he mattered to us. You think you have time to fix things, and then you realize you don't." No one could have guessed how hauntingly prophetic those words would become. Because when news broke years later that Ace Frehley had died unexpectedly, the rock world didn't just lose a legend, Gene and Paul lost a piece of themselves. The silence that followed was deafening, and when the two men finally spoke publicly about Ace's passing, their words carried decades of buried guilt, grief, and truth that would leave fans absolutely stunned. When the shocking news of Ace Frehley's death spread across social media, disbelief swept through the rock community. Fans who had followed his journey from the gritty New York clubs to the world's biggest stages refused to accept it at first. The spaceman, that mischievous, unpredictable energy of Kiss, was gone. It didn't seem real. Within hours, tributes began flooding in. Musicians, friends, and lifelong fans shared photos, memories, and videos of Ace shredding his guitar with that signature grin. But all eyes turned to two men, Paul Stanley and Gene Simmons. The silence from the Kiss founders was deafening. For nearly 2 days, neither spoke publicly. And when they finally did, what they said left fans speechless. Paul's message appeared first. It wasn't a polished press release or a staged statement. It was personal, raw, and heartbreakingly human. He wrote, "I can't believe you're gone, Ace. We went through hell together, and we went through heaven too. No one could make that guitar sing like you did. You were chaos and magic all at once, and I wouldn't change a thing." For Paul, who had always been the steady, controlled force in Kiss, these words revealed a side fans rarely saw: grief without pride. Those close to him said that he broke down while writing it. For all their fights, Paul had always seen Ace as the beating heart of what made Kiss so special in the beginning. Gene Simmons' statement came hours later, during a live interview that was supposed to promote a charity event. When the interviewer cautiously brought up Ace's passing, Gene paused for a long moment before speaking. His voice, normally so bold and confident, cracked. "I didn't call him enough," Gene said quietly. "I thought we had time. Ace was my brother. He was a genius, self-destructive, stubborn, but a genius. We started this dream together in a tiny apartment, and I'll never forget him for as long as I live." Those who knew Gene personally said it was one of the few times he'd ever let his guard down publicly. His admission, "I didn't call him enough," and not struck a chord with millions. It wasn't just a confession. It was a plea of guilt, the kind that comes only when it's too late to make things right. Behind the scenes, both Paul and Gene reportedly attended a private memorial organized by Ace's family and close friends. Away from cameras and fans, they sat side by side for the first time in years, quietly paying their respects. One witness later told a journalist, "They didn't speak much, but they didn't have to. It was like two men carrying the same ghost." In the days that followed, both men opened up more candidly than ever before. Paul admitted in an emotional podcast, "We were young and stupid. We said things, did things we can't take back. But Ace knew, I hope he knew, that I loved him like a brother." Gene, meanwhile, recorded a video message for fans, his eyes filled with visible sorrow. "He was the best of us," he said. "We all had our demons, but Ace's heart was pure." And that laugh, God, that laugh. I can still hear it. The response from fans around the world was overwhelming. Thousands of people lit candles outside venues Kiss had once played, from New York to Tokyo. Old photos resurfaced. Ace with his arm around Gene, both of them grinning like kids who had no idea how big they'd become. It reminded everyone that behind the rock star personas were just men, flawed, passionate, and bound by something deeper than fame: friendship. For Gene and Paul, Ace's death reopened every wound they'd tried to bury, but it also gave them something unexpected, a sense of humility and gratitude. They had built a legacy together, one that would outlive them all. And even though they couldn't fix the past, their confessions made one thing clear: Ace Frehley was never just a bandmate. He was family. In the weeks following Ace Frehley's death, the world of rock seemed quieter. The laughter, the wild stories, the electrifying chaos that defined Kiss's early years, it all felt distant now, like an echo fading in the halls of memory. For Paul Stanley and Gene Simmons, the loss wasn't just professional. It was personal in a way that words could barely express. The man they had once called a brother, fought with, laughed with, and created history alongside, was gone. And for the first time, both men began to publicly unpack decades of pain, guilt, and gratitude. Paul spoke first in a heartfelt tribute concert that was broadcast worldwide. Standing beneath a single spotlight, he said quietly, "We were kids chasing a dream. Ace wasn't perfect. None of us were. But he was real. He made the impossible sound effortless." He paused, his voice trembling slightly. "When we were on stage together, there was no pain, no fighting, no ego, just music. And that's what I'll remember." The crowd stood in silence. Many had tears in their eyes, knowing how complicated the relationship between the bandmates had been. It wasn't just nostalgia. It was grief intertwined with forgiveness. Gene Simmons, who had built a reputation for his unbreakable confidence and larger-than-life persona, seemed profoundly changed. In interviews, he stopped referring to Kiss as a brand or business. Instead, he called it a family that broke apart and never fully healed. One particularly emotional moment came during a podcast when Gene was asked what he would say to Ace if he could speak to him one more time. Gene didn't hesitate. "I'd tell him I'm sorry," he said, his eyes downcast. "Sorry for being too hard on him, for not listening when he was trying to tell us he was hurting. I thought being tough was leadership, but maybe it was fear. I should have told him more often how much he mattered." That admission, coming from a man often seen as stoic and unflinching, hit fans hard. Gene, for once, wasn't speaking as the demon of Kiss. He was speaking as Gene, a man looking back on the cost of pride and the price of unresolved love. Paul and Gene's reflections reignited old memories for fans of the band's earliest days in small New York clubs, where four young dreamers painted their faces and played like their lives depended on it. Ace had always been the wild spark in that equation. His guitar wasn't just sound, it was fire. It screamed of rebellion, of freedom, of the parts of rock and roll that no rule book could contain. In the aftermath of his death, Ace's music experienced a renaissance. Streams and album sales soared. Younger generations discovered Shock Me, New York Groove, and Rocket Ride for the first time, realizing just how influential his sound had been. Even critics who had once dismissed Kiss as too commercial now acknowledged the depth of Ace's artistry. Behind the scenes, Gene and Paul quietly reached out to Ace's family. They helped fund a foundation in his name, a program supporting young musicians battling addiction and mental health struggles. Paul said, "If Ace's story can help save even one kid chasing his dreams, then he's still with us." At a private memorial in New York, a recording of Ace's isolated guitar solo from Shock Me played softly as photos of the band's early days flickered on a screen. Four kids in leather and makeup, ready to take over the world. Gene stood beside Paul, both men visibly emotional. When the music ended, Gene whispered, "Goodbye, Space Ace." In the years since, Paul and Gene have spoken about Ace with nothing but respect. The bitterness that once defined their interviews has vanished. What remains is love, complicated, bruised, but real. Paul once summed it up perfectly in a later interview. "You can't erase history. You can only learn from it. Ace was part of our beginning, and that means he'll always be part of who we are. Today, fans still shout his name at concerts. His face still shines on vintage posters. His solos still echo through speakers around the world. And every time Paul and Gene step on stage, somewhere deep inside, they know that Ace Frehley, their brother, their spaceman, is still with them, playing one last eternal note that never fades."